So I think the Luciferian temptation is part of that offering of becoming as gods is to offer to people the possibility of defining good and evil as subjective creatures, right? So the prohibition that God places on humanity in Genesis is to not eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's a very complicated narrative trope. But one of the, what would you say, the connotations, right? The implications is that there are moral guidelines that are absolute, that aren't within the human realm of the knowledge. It's partly the knowledge, the ability to manipulate, the ability to change or even to define. The fundamental moral propositions are transcendent and axiomatic, and they're not in the proper domain of human maneuvering. It's something like that. And the serpent says to man, no, you can take it all. You can have full knowledge even of the moral axioms. And that seems to be something that's, what would you say? That's off limits if the game of being itself is to progress without catastrophe.
Yeah,
it's something like that.
I think it's exactly like that. Because what is interesting about Genesis is that the first encounter we have with morality in the pages of Genesis, morality is defined not horizontally between humans, but vertically between humans and God. And that's crucial. It's God that defines it ultimately. So there is a transcendence from the very beginning. And it's the loss of that transcendence that we're seeing damaging our culture today, because we've lost that common sense of values that, however distorted it has been over the centuries, that we did owe to the biblical tradition. And now we wander in total confusion. And it interests me greatly that the pressure, particularly on young people today, is to look inside for answers to these questions, when what we need to be teaching them is, no, look outside and have your mind open to the fact that transcendence is real, and that there is a God and there is something bigger. There's something more than materialism is giving you.
Okay, so let's take that apart a bit. You could imagine that there could be three sources of moral knowledge. That's the kind of knowledge that orients you in the world. And one source could be the subjective. Now, we've already talked about the limitations there, is that, well, you don't live very long, and what the hell do you know? And what do you mean by the subjective? Like, which part of you? And then there's the danger of elevating yourself to the status of final moral arbiter, which is a kind of Luciferian presumption. Okay, so those seem like bad pitfalls. The next objection, you might say, is like, okay, well, you can't do it just subjectively. I am who I am, which is certainly the proclamation in our culture. You could do it by consensus, and that's more the view that, well, the group gets together and sort of decides by general agreement what right and wrong is, and that can shift with time and place. But as long as everybody is willing to abide by the same principles, then we can define them canonically as good or as good. But the problem with that is you run...
Yeah, go on. There's a huge problem with that. You tell me what your problem with it is, and then I'll tell you mine.
Well, my problem with that is the Nazi Germany problem.
Exactly.
It's like, well, what the hell happens when the whole herd stampedes towards hell? If you're a consensus person and there's nothing else there, it's like, well, there's no hell. That's consensus. And so the consensus by definition is right. And so if everyone decides that no Jews would be better, who the hell are you to stand in the way? And, if you're willing to stand up and say, well, you should stand in the way, well, right. So upon what grounds do you make that claim? Because it's not merely subjective. So that brings us back to the problem of transcendent morality. Okay, so
Absolutely.
You were going to talk about the problems of consensus.
Yeah? Yes, it's exactly right. That is the problem with utilitarianism. Treating others as you want them to treat you, and by consensus, is fine if you've got equal centers of power. If you've got a whole lot of equal centers of power vying with one another, then you can say, if you don't do this, I won't do that. But the very interesting thing about the case in point you mentioned, Nazi Germany, Hitler, in his political youth, made treaties, but he tore them up once he had the power. And if people say, you shouldn't do that, he said, what do you mean you shouldn't? I've got the power. So it doesn't answer the question, why ought you to go with the herd and murder so many Jews. And that's a huge weakness. It's all right if you're dividing ice cream among children, then utilitarianism is fine. Give an equal amount to all of them or you'll be in trouble. But at the higher level, it's shot through with this problem of the total absence of any transcendence. The oughtness has to come from above.
Okay, so now you talked about power there, and one of the radical claims of the postmodern types, especially people like Foucault, is that the fundamental motivating drive of humanity and perhaps the cosmos itself is power. Now, I think everything Foucault thought about everything is to be taken with a gigantic grain of salt because, he was quite the awful creature. And I think he had every reason for putting forward the proposition that there's nothing other than power because that justified everything he did that was done purely on the basis of power. But there's another problem that emerges with that proclamation, which is a kind of self-evident problem, and I would think this is something the rationalists have a very difficult time with, which is, if I can compel you to do something, why don't the next two propositions follow logically? First of all, if I can compel you, the mere fact that I can indicates precisely that I'm actually a better man than you, because if you were better than me, you could compel me. And of course, this is might makes right, but might makes right is a very powerful doctrine, and almost all the pre-Christian pagan societies operated on that basis in the most fundamental manner. And the aristocratic justification was something like, well, you're a peasant, and the cosmos has established that you're a peasant, and I'm an aristocrat, and so screw you. And actually, morally speaking, because if you weren't a useless slug, you wouldn't be a peasant. And that's a very, very difficult argument to generate a counter proposition to. And the corollary argument is, well, if I can force you, clearly I'm more powerful than you are, and that means that I have every moral right to do so. And in fact, you don't even get to object because you're too lowly to object.
But that reflects,
and that's the way of the world, man.
Yeah, but it reflects a series of values that needs to be questioned. Where do these values come from? To argue that the cosmos made me an aristocrat and you a serf is a very tenuous argument. And in the end, it seems to me that we've got to ask ourselves the fundamental question: what basis have we for valuing human beings as unique? And again, I refer to your comment on Genesis. We're made in the image of God. That gives us huge dignity and value. It was something my parents got across to me when I was very young. And as a Christian, even at the bigger level, the idea that there's a higher value even than the created value, which is the whole topic of Exodus. And I was utterly fascinated by your conversation on Exodus, because the valuation of people that is reflected in the Passover lamb and the sacrifice, in that God accepts them on the basis of a sacrifice. And it seems to me that actually leads me, now that I think of it, into another direction. One of the problems of establishing rules of any kind seems to me that many of them bypass the heart of Exodus. It's very noticeable that the law of the commandments comes after the Passover sacrifice, after the redemption. And in the New Testament, the parallel thing for Christians is the sacrifice is first, the acceptance is settled. It's not on the basis of your moral behavior or life, but that empowers you to live, so that the moral commandments in the letters of Paul, for example, come after the discussion of the sacrifice that gives you a true value. Now, that is something that is lacking at the heart of our culture. We have no answer, ultimately, to the big questions of guilt and the whole problem. Nobody likes the word sin, but that's what it is, the moral damage we cause to ourselves and other people. And setting up rules and regulations is hugely important. We need them. They're in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. But I notice that one of the major messages of Exodus is first redemption. And redemption is by the blood of the Passover lamb, to put it in the biblical language, and then the teaching. And the same exactly in the New Testament.
So let's delve into that. Well, so what appears to happen, as far as I can tell, in the post-Paradise Lost transition in Genesis is that human beings are called upon to sacrifice, right? And you see that particularly in the story of Cain and Abel, because two patterns of sacrifice are laid out in that story. And one is genuine sacrifice, and that's Abel, and the other is half-hearted, self-deceptive, instrumental sacrifice, and that's Cain. And not only does that not go very well for Cain, it engenders bitter, murderous resentment, and then eventually the horrors of war, because Tubal-Cain, who's Cain's descendant, is the first artificer of weapons of war. And it's after that story that the flood comes, and also the Tower of Babel. And so there's two forms of sacrifice outlined. And someone reading that who's a rationalist might object, well, why is sacrifice necessary? And I think that's actually an utterly clueless rejoinder. And here's why. So, for example, if you're going to be a scientist, there was a woman, I think her name was Barbara McClintock, and she spent her whole life studying variations of color in so-called Indian corn. And the consequence of that was she discovered a variety of facts about genetic structure that led to technological improvements in cancer treatment, but she labored in isolation for decades. Now, you might say, well, what was her sacrifice? And that's pretty obvious. Her sacrifice was that there was a trillion things in the world she could have been interested in and pursued. And she sacrificed every single one of them to the curiosity that made itself manifest in relationship to this strange genetic anomaly, right? And the thing is, every time you focus your attention on one thing instead of the multitude of other things, you're making a sacrifice. Okay, so you have to sacrifice in order to attend and act. There's no way out of it. And so then the next question emerges. Here's another element of sacrifice. If you're immature, there's only the present. As you become more mature, there's only the present and there's only you. As you become more mature, there's the future at longer and longer durations, and there's other people. And so what you do as you mature is you sacrifice you and the present to the future and everyone else. And if you don't do that, then you stay dangerously immature and psychopathic, right? Because you're completely self-centered and narcissistic. And so that's not good for you, because narcissistic psychopaths tend to fail, and it's certainly not good for everyone else. So you have to sacrifice to attend and act, and you have to sacrifice to mature. And then you might say, well, what's the sacrifice that's most pleasing to God? And the answer to that has to be something like, well, yourself, right? You have to offer up everything to what's transcendent. And I think that is that sacrifice that you described, that's an a priori act before the coming of the law, right? It's the willingness to voluntarily lay everything on the line in the pursuit of truth and life more abundant, something like that. And I think that is the pattern that's laid out in the Christian story. It looks to me like that's the pattern.
Yeah, well, let me comment on that. I'm very interested that you mentioned Barbara McClintock, because actually she discovered the so-called jumping gene, and she really was the pioneer that's led to this third wave of biology I mentioned earlier. That's just a point aside, but it's extremely interesting. She was a pioneer, and she sacrificed a great deal. But it seems to me that we may need to think in terms of different kinds of sacrifice. You see, at the heart of Christianity is not my sacrifice, but God's sacrifice on my part, a sacrifice that I could not have made, but that sacrifice demands my sacrifice. Offer up your body as a living sacrifice is what Paul says to me as a Christian. But I'm prepared to do that. The power to do that comes from the fact that my acceptance with God depends on a sacrifice that's entirely outside of me, but can be appropriated by me. And that is when Christ died and rose again. Now, this goes very deep, but it goes to the heart of God doing something so that he can forgive me and deal with the guilt that I've incurred by my messed up behavior and all the rest of it. That's one thing. Now, in response to that, yes, of course, we're called upon to sacrifice. And there are all these different levels. A mother sacrifices for her child. She doesn't sacrifice to some God. She gives up her time and her energy, and sometimes slaves very hard working to make ends meet for the children. So she's given her all in that sense and at that level. But there's a much more fundamental level that deals with the problem of human relationship with God that's gone wrong ever since Genesis 3.
So you mentioned that the maternal sacrifice, and so there were archaic societies where people sacrificed their children to the gods, and that meant in some sense that they were giving up something that was valuable and vital to please fate. But what we have come to regard as the appropriate sacrifice on the part of the mother is, as you pointed out, it's herself to her child. And there's something deeper there in that, which is that it's the voluntary sacrifice of the more powerful, and that would be the mother in this case, to the least powerful, right? And so that's the service of the higher to the lower as the exemplar of the highest form of service. That's the proper form of sacrifice. And, I saw the Pieta when I was at St. Peter's, the couple of times I've been there, that great Michelangelo statue. And, that really is emblematic to me of something approximating the female crucifixion, right? Because you have Christ offering his own being in this cataclysmic way to the exigencies of being, let's say, but you have Mary making an offering that's of equivalent pain in some ways, right? Because I think it's a toss-up whether having yourself destroyed by the mob, for example, is a more painful experience than the experience of a mother watching her child be torn apart by the ravenous mob, right? But we would also say, I think to the degree that we have any sense, that a mother who is performing her role properly, she offers herself to the glorious adventure of her child, right? She puts herself secondary to her child's needs, but she's also doing that in a way that offers the child to be to enter upon the full adventure of the world. And that would mean the voluntary acceptance of something like suffering and death, right? Because that's the destiny of everyone. Now, a mother could try to protect her child against that and against the knowledge of that, but that turns her into, a devouring mother, right? Someone who destroys the burgeoning ability of the child to thrive. And so there's a dual acceptance of sacrifice on the part of the properly behaving mother. She has to sacrifice herself to the child, especially in infancy, but then she has to be willing to let the child go to be broken by the world. And that is the route to, as you pointed out, that's part of the divine pattern. It seems to be part of the divine pattern of eternal salvation. It's something like that. It's very paradoxical, right? Because it means you have to take the full weight of mortality onto yourself voluntarily and maintain your moral orientation, and that's actually the key to, that's the key to paradise, I suppose. That's one way of thinking about it. That's a key to reacquiring what you lost in childhood.
Yeah. Taking the full weight of mortality upon yourself is hugely important. It's transformed, of course, if we believe that death is not the end. And as I am convinced that Christ rose from the dead, this introduces up, for me, a huge new world of possibility, that I am mortal, but physical death, that is not going to be the end. So as I get older, my own personal orientation towards the future gets brighter and brighter, because I know that whatever happens, if I am taken by cancer or COVID or anything else, that there has been a new life that I already possess, according to the New Testament, a power within me that enables me to live, but will also raise me from the dead on the last day. And that's a huge hope. Of course, it's the central Christian hope. And it would be unfortunate not to hear that side of Christianity. And I feel many people today don't listen to the whole, in a sense, the whole meta-narrative that Christianity offers, because they would see in it that there's a real prospect for the future, that it does answer the problem of physical death in a much better way than the possibly pseudo-promises of transhumanist engineering.
Well, all right, let me approach that psychologically to some degree. When you're talking about anything that's theological, the psychological can only make inroads to a certain depth. But look, one of the things that psychologists have agreed upon on the clinical front for the last 5 or 6 decades, I would say, so quite a long time, is that if you can voluntarily get your clients to expose themselves to the things that they're afraid of and are avoiding as they're making their way to their destination, that makes them braver and more competent. It's not exactly that it reduces their fear. It produces within them a revelation of their own strength. So, for example, if you take a woman who's agoraphobic and who is afraid of getting on an elevator because she thinks she'll have a heart attack on the elevator and be unable to get to a hospital and will die stupidly and loudly in front of the crowd in the elevator, because that's the typical agoraphobic fantasy, you can teach her to reacquaint herself with elevators through graduated exposure, right? And so you're basically taking the thing that she's most afraid of and then feeding it to her in graduated doses. Now, what happens is she not only becomes able to take the elevator, but a lot of fears that had beset her also vanish simultaneously. And the reason for that is that she sees that when she encounters something she thought was beyond her capability, there's something within her that reveals itself that's bigger than the fear.
Oh, but there's also a theological aspect to that. I mean, I think that psychological insight is very important. It's another example of it is, of course, if someone's afraid of flying, you need to get them onto a plane. You need to acquaint them with the actual reality of which they are afraid. But you also get that in situations theologically where people are afraid of the future. And why is that? Because they don't know enough about what God offers to people to conquer those fears. It doesn't mean they'll disappear completely, but it means that they can orientate themselves and come to terms with those things. So I would take that insight absolutely, because I use it all the time myself with other people.
Well, then people shrink away if they don't have that faith. And so on the mythological front, you see this reflected in the dragon encounter stories that Tolkien made so famous, for example. And the idea is that if you can find the dragon that lurks in the deepest cavern, that's where the gold is hoarded. And so the Christian notion of resurrection is an extension of that corpus of ideas, because it's predicated on the notion that if you forthrightly confronted the whole panoply of the horrors of death in its multiple forms, death and betrayal and the catastrophe of the mob, if you faced all of that, what you would see as a consequence is not so much eternal darkness as the eternal resurrection of the light. You know, and it's a limit case, right? And I really, it's hard for me to know what to make of that, again, on the psychological front, because it's a truism, definitely, both in the narrative domain and in the practical clinical domain, is that if people can find it within themselves to voluntarily shoulder the burden of confronting what they're afraid of, they definitely get braver and more competent. You know, and some of that's because they get informed about themselves, but there are also even biological transformations that take place. You know, if you voluntarily face a stressor, entirely different psychophysiological systems are manifest in you as a consequence of the voluntary confrontation that would be manifest if it was imposed on you involuntarily. It's a whole different spirit that inhabits you. That's a very good way of thinking about it. It's genuinely a different spirit that inhabits you. And it makes itself manifest all the way from the cellular level upward. And the habitual practice of that attitude of voluntary confrontation can switch on new genes. It doesn't just happen conceptually. It actually transforms you physiologically. And we have no idea what the limit of that is.
There's a very interesting...
Đó là xong cái nội dung của cái câu B của mình. Câu C, xác định tần số gấp của dao động. Xác định tần số gấp là cái omega đó các bạn. Các bạn có T rồi thì chúng ta dựa vào công thức tính chu kỳ. Đúng chưa? Các bạn dựa vào công thức tính chu kỳ nè, ta có nè. T bằng 2pi chia cho omega. Vậy thầy suy ra omega bằng 2pi chia T. Đúng không ạ? 2pi chia cho 0,4. Rồi các bạn rút gọn lên, ở đây là 10, 20 chia cho 4 thì được 5 pi. Đơn vị là radian trên giây. Nhớ tần số gấp là omega, có đơn vị là radian trên giây. Đó là xong nội dung cái bài số 2 của mình. Chúng ta đi qua cái bài số 3. Hình 2.3 là dao động điều hòa của một con lắc. Hãy cho biết vị trí và hướng di chuyển của con lắc tại thời điểm ban đầu. Tức là đề bài người ta hỏi tại thời điểm ban đầu là thời điểm t bằng 0 nè. Thì vị trí của nó ở đâu, tức là x0 này nó bằng bao nhiêu? Và hướng di chuyển của nó, tức là vận tốc này, vận tốc v0 này nó cùng chiều dương hay là nó chuyển động ngược chiều dương? Các bạn nói được 4 cái ý này, tức là chúng ta đã làm xong câu A. Được chưa? Rồi, như vậy để trả lời được 4 cái ý này á, các bạn phải dựa vào cái đồ thị của nó. Và vị thời điểm ban đầu, các bạn chú ý nè, thời điểm ban đầu tức là cái tại thời điểm t bằng 0 đây. Các bạn coi tại thời điểm t bằng 0, đúng không ạ? T bằng 0 đây, vật ở vị trí có ly độ là trừ A nè. Và các bạn thấy nó đang đi lên, đúng chưa? Đồ thị nó đi lên, tức là nó đi